Welcome to the CPACE Podcast, produced by the University of Pittsburgh's Computational Pathology and AI Center of Excellence. I'm your host, Jordan Gospore, a science reporter covering the integration of artificial intelligence into pathology and laboratory medicine. In this series, we'll explore how AI advancements and pioneering research in digital pathology are not only shaping the future of healthcare and diagnostic excellence, but also fostering new opportunities for collaboration, linking researchers, clinicians, and healthcare companies. Thanks, everyone, for joining us again on the CPACE Podcast. Today, we're going to speak with Graeme Penney, Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Liron Medical, which makes AI-powered 3D mapping technology for health applications. To get us started, Graeme, would you like to introduce yourself? Also, as a science reporter, could I ask you to share for us, what's Liron Medical?
So I'm Graeme Penney. I'm Chief Scientific Officer at Liron Medical. Prior to that, I worked as a senior lecturer at both UCL and King's College London. And prior to that, I did my PhD at King's College London. And actually, part of the work that went in to develop Liron is work that I originally did on my PhD. In the last 10 years, I've been working at Liron Medical. I was one of the founders with a surgeon, Tom Carroll. We span out from a combination of St Thomas's Hospital and King's College London. And what we do, we're primarily a cloud-based software company. We provide services to clinicians who carry out minimally invasive surgery operations. And so you might have also heard of those called keyhole surgery, and particularly the ones that are guided with real-time X-rays, often called fluoroscopy imaging. And what we do is we provide tools for the surgeons to work with preoperatively. So before the operation, all of these patients that we work with would have had CT scan, which is 3D X-ray image. And the surgeons carry out quite a lot of work to plan what they want to do in the operation and plan the information that's really useful for them to see during the operation. Then we have a really big component, which is actually during the operation. We're able to map that plan to these X-ray images during the operation. And we do that on a purely image-based process, so from one image to the other. And that requires quite high performance computing, and it requires state-of-the-art computer vision algorithms to do that. And we then have another component at the end of the operation and ongoing on a yearly basis in order to help the surgeons monitor the outcomes of the operation.
To give us a feel for how Liron maps are being used, what initial clinical applications did you and your team concentrate on developing first when you launched Liron Medical? Next, can you tell us what applications you're working on right now and what sorts of applications might we see in the future?
So the operations we started out with, it was kind of an accident of our birth, really, in that the surgeon who I founded this with, Tom Carroll, he came to find me when I was working as a lecturer, and he had just started doing some really complex operations on aortic aneurysms. And so you've got the aorta, the major blood vessel coming out of the heart. What can happen through various reasons is you can get weaknesses, and then that forms into an aneurysm. And if left untreated, that can burst with quite catastrophic effects. So there's a high mortality that comes from that. And about 35 years ago, people started, as part of this kind of minimally invasive surgery revolution that happened and has been going on since then, people started treating these through an endovascular approach. So they would make small incisions in the arteries in the groin, and then they can pass devices up that are called stent grafts. And these, it's effectively a wire mesh with a fabric covering around it. And the idea is that you position this so that the top of it is in healthy tissue and the bottom of it is in healthy tissue. And then this fabric is taking the high arterial blood pressure rather than the weakened wall of the artery. And it should have a much lower chance of bursting because of that. And because the operation had been so successful and not everybody could benefit from it, they were trying to push it in order to benefit as many people as possible. And so they developed what they call complex operations. And this is when the aneurysm actually spanned some of the major blood vessels that you would get in that area. So the ones going out to the kidney, stomach, spleen, and liver, for example. And this then made it quite a tricky operation to do. And if you can imagine, you're there because you're in minimally invasive kind of mode as a surgeon, you can't feel or directly see what you're doing. You're having to look at fluoroscopy images for that. But the fluoroscopy images, they're grainy because you want low dose. You don't want to give the patients high radiation. You can't even see the vasculature unless you inject a dye, and that dye is bad for the patient's kidneys, so you don't want to do that too much. And you're looking at a 2D shadow of what's going on. And all of a sudden, you've got these really complicated operations when you might be trying to insert, say, 10 or so stent grafts and plumb in all of these major arteries within there. And the Tom came to me and kind of said, we're doing these operations. I really think we could get better visualization for this. It would really help me in the operations. And I still find it amazing that, I was working 2 floors above him at St. Thomas's Hospital, and I'd done my PhD in this area. And we could the software still worked. So I could get up and running quite quickly. We were under research ethics. And quite quickly, it was quite obvious that, I was really being able to help them in this operation. And so it's kind of that you get an extra channel of information coming in. You're getting 3D information that comes from this CT scan, and it's overlaid, and it can kind of be overlaid much more often than you would ever take these other images with the dye that you're injecting. And, to begin with, some of these operations were really long. The longest one that I was involved in was about 10 hours. And what we'd find was that there'd be times when this extra channel of information really helped the surgeons. And we kind of brought down this really long tail to a much more manageable length of time for the operations. And there was kind of like much more confidence, and it was much more useful that they could be using this information as well. And so these complex operations have kind of been our main, where we're most useful, really. And they're the ones that have driven the applications really in a number of areas. And they kind of drove us. We had the real driving force in order to kind of get the funding in order to make the system work really quickly and really accurately and robustly. But once you've done that, you then find that it's useful in lots of other areas where people wouldn't have actually, taken the time to begin with when it was a much harder system to work with. And so it has proved really useful in the more standard operations of that type. It's proved really useful in something called aortic dissection, which is when the wall of the aorta can come away from the main bit of the aorta. And there you can get really complicated issues because you've got multiple blood flowing pathways. And so if you're inserting devices, you don't know which of these kind of areas that you're in. It's just a harder anatomy to visualize. It's useful as well when vessels become occluded, which means they become blocked. And in those situations, you can't actually inject any contrast in to see the vessels because they're blocked. You only see where blood is flowing. And so people have made markers within there. But we have quite a generic system in theatre, which is really great. And so if there are applications where the clinicians, there's information in the preoperative image that they want to use, and we have reasonably generic tools that they can extract that with. And then if they're carrying out an operation under fluoroscopy guidance in the chest, abdomen and pelvis, when they can see vertebra, that's what we match on, then they can overlay that. And so it's been a pleasure working with clinicians and for them coming back to us and finding out how they've been using it and what they've been using it on.
Thinking about your answer, I'd like to mention that on the CPACE podcast, we try to incorporate questions from students and industry in our interviews. In this case, Sanish Sivaraj Kumar asks if you can elaborate on the specific machine learning algorithms and neural network architectures used in SIDAR's 3D mapping technology. Sanish is a PhD student in the Biomedical Informatics Intelligence Systems program at the University of Pittsburgh, where he's working on multimodal AI and NLP for clinical decision-making. Also, adding to Sanish's question, can I also ask, how is SIDAR keeping up with advances in AI and machine learning?
Yeah, so we've been kind of running parallel, and it's been amazing, to be able to make use of them. For the actual matching process, I think we'd probably come under the term of kind of old school AI, because we don't use much machine learning with there for the actual matching process. We do use the machine learning in terms of the algorithm once it's found its match, it has to then decide whether it's confident enough to show the result or not. And that's actually a very difficult task in itself. Probably about half our computing power goes on when we do this. But for the actual matching process, what we have is these preoperative images, which are CT scans. We do about 20 minutes processing on these before the operation. And to give an example of how much we sped things up, there were times when that could have taken 48 hours when we first of all started, and we've got it down to 20 minutes now. And that's you can generate synthetic images from these CT scans. And what we do is we generate lots of these synthetic images, and kind of the game that we play is we need to find which of these synthetic images looks as similar as possible to the image we're actually getting out of the operating room. And to do that really quickly, we use something called the generalized Hopf transform, and that gets us to within like 5 millimeters and about 10 degrees or so. And then we actually generate these images on the fly, and then we can refine that accuracy down to be much better. So that's the matching process. But what we have been doing as well in the background is we've been running we run machine learning on the CT images that are uploaded to us. And so there's particular anatomy that the surgeons want to see. It's the aorta and the associated blood vessels. When we first of all started out, it was like a semi-automatic segmentation method that we had available that they had to do work on. It might take them 5 or 10 minutes to get the result that they wanted. We've now produced models that just do that for them, and it's brilliant, and they do a better job. But we're always kind of in the game with this, that we believe that it's kind of like this symbiotic relationship, that the computer should do what they're good at, but you still then want the human to check it. And so we need to position the result of what the computer has done in relation to the raw data for them, and then give them the tools that they can both analyze how well it's done, and they can change it if they'd like something different on there. So that was using the UNet architecture. We've also extended that because that only found out where the blood was flowing, but we produced something else that we call the whole aorta, which includes where the blood's flowing and also blood clot. And we also chopped this one up into kind of anatomical regions that a clinician would understand based upon where the major blood vessels are. And so that was quite nice as we were putting in, real anatomical names into a model and getting out a kind of model that a clinician would look at and not only see anatomy, but also see anatomy that's labeled in this way. And we calculate volumes from that, and it's whether or not these aneurysms have grown or shrunk, which is a good indicator of how well the operation has done. And I suppose there's one that was also using the UNet architecture. And there's one other model that I'd like to mention, because it was one of the first that we deployed. And the clinicians, they like to be able to denote the major blood vessels by putting a ring around them. And if you've got a 3D kind of interface, positioning a 2D interface, and you're trying to position a 3D object, that can be quite tricky, just the interaction with it and the underlying images. And so we developed a system with machine learning where it got trained on thousands of these manually positioned rings that we'd been positioning anyway for the clinicians. And what it did was the clinicians would kind of give it a starting position, kind of the middle of it, and it would then come up with where it thought it was best. And so in order to position a ring, you need to know 6 numbers. You need to know its position, orientation, and size. And what's really interesting is that the way that this was kind of absorbed by the end user, I think it's the way that AI often goes in that it just seems right. So they'll give it 3 numbers, they'll click a button to position a ring, it will appear there, it looks right to them, they're happy, they don't realize that this has happened in the background really, and that AI has worked for them and done this for them. And it's kind of, when things just work, that's the way I think that AI often comes in here. And they've still got full control over this. If they don't like where it is, they can move it, they can change its size, its orientation, all of that kind of stuff. But if you're particularly working with images, it's like, hey, that's where I wanted it to be and that's where it appeared. I can now just move on to the next one.
You mentioned data annotation. On the University of Pittsburgh's Health and Explainable AI podcast, we interviewed Gaurav Kaushik, who's the co-founder of Science.io. His team works with healthcare data and they do a huge amount of work around data annotation and structuring information. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind elaborating on how you're annotating your data and on annotation services that CyDar Medical provides.
So to begin with, we were really lucky in that we offer a clinical service and we have information in the routine processing of that clinical service of things such as where the rings go on these models. And so to begin with, we were doing things manually. And so we had all the data of where things were manually positioned. And so it was already all labeled for us because we'd labeled it over the providing of this service. More recently, we're trying to do things that we weren't doing the manual work for, and in which case we've then had to do manual labeling for this. And so, as I'm sure you know, this can be quite labor intensive. We do quite a lot of it internal. We also do outsource. There's a number of companies out there that will do this for you. And we've got quite a nice match up in that we analyze how well the external labelers are doing it. We can compare that with our internal resources and check that effectively we can check that there's no statistically significant difference between us doing it in-house or outsourcing it. And so, yeah, we've worked with a great team that have done that for us, and it's been invaluable for us to do it.
It's clear that you and your team are playing a leading role in advancing 3D mapping for clinical applications, and the way that CyDar Medical is annotating data is no doubt setting some industry standards. Would you say that this is true? And in what areas do you see yourselves as leaders in your field?
So we're probably in the leader seat, I think, for the way we do the matching and the overlays in the operating theatre. So there's a number of companies out there that do kind of what I would call computer-assisted surgery, where you have an image before the operation and you're then looking to match that to the patient in the operation. And people do that in neurosurgery and spinal surgery. And there are companies that also do it in the vascular space, which is where we mostly work. Nearly all of them tend to do it using hardware. So in the vascular space, for example, they'll be tracking the bed and they'll be tracking the X-ray imaging device. Whereas we really do it on the software base. We're just matching one image directly to another one. And the trouble with the hardware is that you have to find a match somehow to begin with, and that can be really difficult. And these companies normally get the clinicians to do this, or radiographers. I think they'd be called rad techs in the US to do that. That's a really difficult task for a human to do accurately. And, you know, I'm a really big believer in if computers can do it, we really should be getting and if they can do it better, we really should be getting the computers to do it. The other issue with the hardware tracking is that things go, we can kind of call it going stale. The match can go stale over time. The patients can move on the bed. They haven't always got a general anesthetic. And even if they do, they can kind of be moved up the bed by when these instruments are delivered to them. And we've been able to measure how much they've moved. And it's been, you know, more than a centimetre in sometimes, which are quite big errors when you're looking at the accuracy that we're looking for these operations. Whereas we just always match from one picture to the next. So if a new picture comes up, we're matching to that. Doesn't matter if the patient's moved, we're still just matching back to the picture. And so I like to think that we are leading in the way that we do this. And I think that there will be more companies doing it in our way in the future. So with regard to the work that we do before the operation in the preoperative planning stage, there's been some great work that we've done there in the segmentation, so the extraction of the information that the surgeons want to use during the operation. And that work, it's been fantastic to work in that area because of all of the great work that's gone on in the last decade involving deep learning and machine learning. And we have a fantastic machine learning team at CyDar. They've up to date with all of this way of working. And I'd just like to point out really here that it's not only knowing what the really good techniques are, but it's also knowing how to tailor those to your particular topic and how to kind of augment your data. And we've had 10 years of experience of doing that and are very good at doing that. So that's the actual kind of skills and expertise in producing the model. But there's also the data that you need. And we have a fantastic pool of process data at CyDar. And there's also the labeling, which I touched upon on the previous answer, to the previous question. And with all those three things combined, we produce models that are truly fantastic, really, compared to what you'd get 15 years ago. You can just input a CT scan, and then the output is, this information, rich information upon the vasculature that the surgeons want to look at. And I truly believe that we're world leaders in our ability to do that as well.
In your answer, you touched on addressing another one of our students' questions, which is, how do you address challenges like tissue deformation and patient movement?
Okay, I've addressed half of that actually, which is the patient movement, but the tissue deformation one is still really big and valid. And although we match on vertebrae and we're then projecting primarily the aorta, and although that remains relatively rigidly attached to the vertebra, it doesn't move much with breathing or cardiac cycle, for example. It does deform if you're introducing these devices into the aorta. And we noticed quite early on, because we're really accurate, we could notice how the deformation was occurring. And things tend to get pushed up the body by about 3 millimeters, but they can go up to 1 centimeter as well. And so, again, in the same kind of vein of getting the computer to do what it's good at and leaving the things that it's not yet good at to the human, we do the rigid match with the computer algorithms. We do also counteract a bit for intervertebral movement with the computer algorithms because we can match on each individual vertebra. But then the clinicians have got a method. They can press a button on the screen. They can then get an image of the aorta coming up. And if they've got one of these images that have been generated with the computer dye, where they can see the blood vessels, they can then pick handles upon the aorta and they can move it. They can deform it, and it deforms in a smooth, kind of realistic manner. They can move it into the place where it's lying now on the operating table, and then they can fix it in that place. And so they can kind of update, we kind of view it that they're updating this mapping for the non-rigid part. And then they can then use the updated map going forward throughout the operation. And maybe it might deform again, and then maybe they might need to deform it a second time coming back. But we find that most of our users, they'll put the devices in, they'll take one of these images with the contrast, they'll deform it, and then after that, it's kind of good to go, and it keeps it, and it's accurate enough for them then for the rest of the operation.
Graeme, if you don't mind, I've got one more student question for you. And this one comes from Daoud Aliyah, a third-year biomedical engineering student at Muhimbili University of Health and Allied Sciences in Tanzania. To preface our students' questions, his university's AI lab is experimenting with developing an AI algorithm for the detection of breast cancer using breast ultrasound and mammograms. In the lab's case, the detection of cancer is their first objective. But as a second objective, they'd also like to generate location and other information on tumors themselves that's useful to support their surgical removal. Daoud asks, can you tell us if it's possible and practical to use AI and 3D mapping to, for example, estimate a tumor's size and shape to assist doctors in planning removal surgery? I know that your team focuses on vascular applications, but what are your thoughts on a question like this?
So I've never worked directly with breast tumor imaging, but in the lab that I used to work in, there were a number of people who had projects in breast tumors. And one of them actually was looking at the ability to map tumors from MRI images back to the patient during operations. I mean, you can see these tumors in MR imaging, in ultrasound, in mammography. The one issue that I think the really big difficulty with breast imaging and mapping it into surgery is that the images are normally, with the MR, for example, they're taken with the patient lying on their front. In surgery, they're lying on their back. The breast is normally very deformable. And so you have a very large deformation problem there. So even if you can find the lesion and segment it accurately in the preoperative images, you've then got a very big deformation task. The work with actually finding it with AI algorithms, I know you can see these well in ultrasound and in MRI. I'm not sure what percentage you can see, and I'm not sure how accurately you can define their boundaries. But with all the work that's gone on with image segmentation, if you have, as long as the answers to those first two questions are positive, if you can get enough data and you can get it well labeled, I see no reason why you can't then end up with accurate segmentation from these.
Here on the CPACE podcast, we're particularly interested in computational pathology and AI. Can I ask, for the benefit of our listeners, in your view, are advances in 3D mapping relevant to computational pathology and laboratory medicine? Can you make the connection for us?
So when I was back being an academic, I worked a little bit with pathology, with slides and histology. And, there was work there in image registration when you'd get a number of different histological slices, and the actual mechanism of slicing could cause deformation between those slices. And there was non-rigid methods that we were working on in order to get a more coherent 3D volume out from that. Also worked in things such as with optical coherence tomography and confocal microscopy, and methods by which, the registration methods to map those types of images together could well be useful. One other way that there might be of interest with this was a grant that I think was just going in when I left, but that all involved mapping information from kind of different scales. And so what might be possible with a system such as we have at SIDAR, where you're tracking instruments, if one of those instruments was taking a biopsy, you can then know where that biopsy has been taken if you took 2 X-ray images, for example. And if you were to take a series of biopsies such as that, you could then know the relative position of all of those and be able to map it back to kind of a macroscopic level in the CT scan. And I'm kind of assuming that the knowledge of how the kind of microscopic information and where this comes from on a macroscopic level could be quite interesting to know from in a pathology lab. Just picking up from what other bits you asked in your question there, large amounts of data we work with, CT scans can be very big, how to manipulate them, how to store them, how to work with them in a regulatory environment. We've had to learn skills in how to do that and to get all our regulations as well. And so there may well be knowledge that we could pass on, or we can learn from each other in how that's done.
Before we wrap up our interview, I'm curious, what kind of project would you love to see students take on relevant to your work and the kinds of things that you're excited about?
We haven't done this because it's really difficult, but that makes it a good student project, I think. And we regularly get asked by our clinicians, can we do non-rigid matching? So, I mentioned earlier that we have this tool that enables them to move the aorta around in order to match it together. It would be fantastic we did look at this about 14 years ago, I think. We do know how difficult it is, but so much has happened over that time, particularly on the AI space, that I think could really help with it. And so to resurrect that with our previous knowledge in order to guide it, and with, all of our knowledge of how things move, and with what we've learned from running this system over the last 10 years, it would be fantastic to supervise a student who was working in that area. And the clinicians would love it as well. It's one of the things that is most often requested when we speak to them.
Graeme, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I'm leaving the floor open to you. Would you like to give any shout outs recognizing your colleagues, your partners, before we close the interview?
Definitely, yeah. It's been a real pleasure for me to work with the people I've worked with at SIDAR. We've got a fabulous bunch there. In my science team, it's amazing when we look back 10 years where we started and where we are now. So it's been fabulous working with them. It's also been brilliant. I'm more of an algorithmics kind of person, and I can code, but I wouldn't call my coding to be the best out there by a long way. It's been brilliant to work with the dev team and to learn so much about how coding's done, and I've also learned how much I don't know about it, so pick up. Small company, you see all aspects, so it's great working with people on the regulatory side, people on the commercial side. The clinicians we work with are fantastic. We couldn't do without them. It's so brilliant hearing their feedback. It's great hearing their advice and their guidance as to where we go in the future. And if I can just finish with one thing that's always important, and that's the funding. I can't have time to give a shout out to all the people who've invested in SIDAR. I'd love to, but I don't have time. But one thing I would really like to highlight is, our initial funders, who were the charity at St Thomas's Hospital. Liron Pantanowitz charity, without their initial funding, there would have been no follow-on funding. That would have been impossible. They were brilliant for the initial funding, and they really stood by us in our early days and helped us through. So big thanks to them as well.
Thinking about everyone who has supported Sidar Medical and your team, it's inspiring to see how much your team has been able to accomplish since you launched your company. And it's nice to see a startup venture succeed. Thanks to all of your hard work and to so many people coming together to support your journey.
I totally agree with you. It's a long and difficult road. The rewards, though, are really big. It's not easy, and you need really good people. You need a lot of help, and you need a lot of luck as well. But it is, I've got my PhD. I've published some papers. That's all brilliant stuff. But watching what you produced, on a screen that's helping surgeons treating their patients is fantastic. And I've got the benefit of doing that and knowing that the algorithms are running, in 2 different continents, working, helping surgeons every day with emergency cases as well. And I think that's why a lot of the people come to work for us. They all have that drive as well. They want to make stuff that helps patients, and this is our vehicle to do that.
Graeme, congratulations again on all that you've done. Great job, and thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. From the University of Pittsburgh, thanks everyone for tuning in and for following this series. Join us again soon to hear how AI is not only shaping the future of healthcare and diagnostic excellence, but also fostering new opportunities for collaboration linking researchers, clinicians, and healthcare companies.